Thank you, Wilson. Um, and appreciate being here today. When Wilson asked me to do this talk, I was like, well, this is perfect. Sci-fi, genetics, makes sense. But in researching it, I was like, okay, this is a little bit more difficult than I expected. Some of these films or the posters that I'm going to talk about today fit really, really nicely with genetic concepts and scientific discoveries. Others don't so much as I expected them to. But we're going to get through it and hopefully give you guys a little bit of information about maybe what was happening at the time that these films were actually released and produced. A little bit about what I do. A lot of people don't know what a genetic counselor is. I'm guessing many of you have probably never even heard of that. What I do is I essentially see patients who have genetic disease, personal history or family history of genetic disease, or people that are suspected of having genetic disease, and I do genetic testing or walk alongside them to make a genetic diagnosis, and then from there provide a lot of support, resources, advocacy for those families that may have a genetic diagnosis. So I have a master's in genetics, that's my background. And so as we go through this today, full disclosure, I am not an art historian or even a world history historian, but I am going to attempt to talk about not necessarily the artwork itself, but really the art of the film and the influences at the time when these films were being produced. So if we consider that film and art mirror the trends in science and culture, then I think this collection is really important as serving as an archive of those discoveries from the 20s all the way through the 70s. And a lot of that you notice in the horror films and the sci-fi films are these kind of fears and these social anxieties that accompany new things that are happening, whether it's scientific discovery or whether it's war. And so I think a lot of that plays out in the artist's use of the posters that were used to demonstrate the films. So I'm not going to forget about the art. I'm going to talk a little bit about the art at the very beginning. And I think that you guys can probably appreciate that a lot of the posters that were released, especially in the 30s, all had a very similar look to them, a similar feel to them. I found that that a lot of the artwork was actually produced by the studios themselves. So Karoly Gross was a Hungarian-American artist that worked for Universal, and he was the main illustrator in the 30s for a lot of the pieces that we see. So Bride of Frankenstein, he also did The Mummy, The Invisible Man, I believe, as well as the Dracula that we think of in the 30s. So all of those were lithographs. And the reason that we appreciate this collection so much is the fact that those posters were produced exclusively for the actual venue that was showing the film at the time. And so afterwards, they would be recycled. It was the Depression. It was also the war. So a lot of those posters never made it out. So the fact that Kirk Hammett has this collection is really valuable. So again, when researching this talk and taking a look at all of these posters, we really notice the things that they have in common. Even though many of these films were in black and white, the artists chose to illustrate the posters in color. And of course, that was for dramatization, for marketing. And there's a big emphasis on light and dark, big contrast for all of these posters. Wide use of complementary colors is something that I noticed. I am an artist for fun. I am not well versed in the arts, but do have some color theory, and that was something that stuck out to me was this complementary use of colors, a lot of the reds and greens, blues and yellows, and a lot of red, which makes sense. Red suggests danger. So one thing that I did find is that there were subtle trends as the decades moved forward from the 20s through the 70s and how these posters did change. In the 30s, which all three of these films were released in the 30s, the films or the posters were focused on the stars or the characters that were actually playing in the film. So you can see in The Mummy, Karloff's name is really large. If you didn't know who Boris Karloff was at the time, you might think the name of the movie was Karloff. And so the same thing goes for a lot of Bela Lugosi's films, who was Dracula. In many of the other films, Lugosi is in large letters. So also another thing that stands out is like the typography and the font that's used during the 30s. It's really big, bold, kind of in your face. Also, the font used speaks to the genre and kind of what's happening in the movie. So I think with The Mummy, the fact that it comes to life in cursive really suggests kind of movement, away from the fact that The Mummy is just kind of this stiff-looking font, lifeless, doesn't suggest movement. Similarly, if you can appreciate it in this up on the screen, Catch Me If You Can, The Invisible Man, that font almost appears like it's disappearing or bleeding. And then, of course, Dracula is very imposing, large font with red letters, also appears to be flying. So all of this kind of grouped together to instill fear in the person who's viewing the poster. And I think that fear is a lot of what I'm going to talk about is the societal fear and anxiety around what's happening at the time that these movies were released. Lastly, the one thing that I think stands out pretty significantly are the use of the people's eyes in all the posters. The eyes are really focused on, convey emotion, again, that fear or anxiety. Comparing that, going back a decade to the 20s, both of these films were early 20s, both out of Germany, both silent films. Sounds like Dr. Caligari was already shown at the Nick. Nosferatu going to be shown this Friday. But the 20s was a little bit different focus than the 30s. The designs typically featured a scene from a movie rather than the characters that were playing in the movie. So as you can see with the Nosferatu, that's actually a scene that's from the movie. And then the example for the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari is that there's nowhere on here of who is actually playing that character. So it's just an interesting comparison between the 20s and the 30s. So I'm sure everyone knows who Nosferatu is. If you don't, I'm going to give you a little bit of background on him. Love vampires, probably my favorite genre of horror. And Nosferatu was the first attempt, or the earliest surviving attempt that we know of at least, to put a vampire on the screen. He was an infringement on the copyright of Bram Stoker's Dracula, however. That had already been written, and so this film was produced unbeknownst to Bram Stoker. What's really interesting about Nosferatu, though, is that if you compare Dracula and the physique of Dracula and then the physique of Nosferatu, they couldn't be any more different. Dracula is kind of the tall, dark, handsome, romantic. People think about Dracula, and there's almost always like this sexuality that's connected to him. Whereas Nosferatu there's nothing sexual about this guy. I mean, he's very sickly looking, very scary. I mean, truly horror. And one that's been proposed about Nosferatu's physique and image is that it was based upon a rare genetic condition that was occurring still today, but probably a little bit more frequently then. It's a type of porphyria. So specifically, the name of the condition is called erythropoietic protoporphyria, and it's essentially a chronic anemia. And individuals that have EPP, which I'm going to use instead of saying that long name again, people with EPP, they are lacking a compound called heme. And you might remember from your science class back in middle school that heme is an iron-containing molecule, and it makes up hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is really important in our red blood cells because it carries oxygen and iron, and it makes sure that our tissues and organs are well oxygenated and have the proper nutrients to function normally. So individuals that are missing this heme component have chronic and significant severe anemia. And so as a result, they're often they have photosensitivity to light because a lot of the issues from this cascade of events in their body build substances up in their hands and their faces primarily, where any sunlight, UV light, can cause blistering or even disfigurement. So that kind of plays along the idea of this vampire myth of not being able to be out in the sunlight. Interestingly, when Bram Stoker wrote Dracula, he did not mention sunlight as a lethal issue for the vampire. He said that he didn't like being out in the sun, he preferred the night, but never that it would cause him to die or go up in a puff of smoke or anything like that. So Nosferatu, with his characteristic image, as well as the fact that they wrote in this, can't be in the sunlight thing, really lends itself to this EPP diagnosis. Furthermore, these individuals oftentimes have a receding gum line, so their teeth will appear to look much larger than they would. So that might suggest why Nosferatu has these kind of larger incisors. Let's see, the sunken eyes, the fatigued look, all of that relates directly to an anemic individual. So people who had this condition would, in the medieval times, would drink animal blood. That was the way that they would get the hemoglobin back in their bodies. So drinking blood, not being out in the sunlight, kind of characteristic physique, it kind of lends itself to where Nosferatu got his this characteristic picture. To further that, this condition, EPP, the American Porphyria Foundation says that there's probably a few hundred of these cases at any given time worldwide. So it's not like it's this common condition. In fact, it's a recessive disease, which means that both parents have to be carriers of a disease in order for a child to even be affected by it. So we know that these types of conditions are more prominent in smaller rural areas where individuals who are having children together may be closely related genetically. So it's not unheard of that maybe in Eastern European times that this was more common in those groups of people, and we know that the vampire myth started in Eastern Europe and came westward. So kind of interesting that Nosferatu may have had his influence by an actual genetic condition. Similarly, another poster that's in the exhibit is the Barnum poster, and there's a lot of underlying genetic innuendos that are shown in this poster, or examples of genetic disorders in this film. This is in French, so it's saying that all the monsters in the universe. There was an American version of this film, and they called it Freaks, was across the top. Of course, today we would never use those terms, freaks or monsters, to describe anyone with physical differences or disabilities, but that's what they were doing in this film. It was a comedy, and it was meant to be based around what we now know today as the Ringling Brothers Circus, or P.T. Barnum. In the 18th, 19th, and even early 20th century, these sideshow acts would travel around, and there would be performers that had certain physical differences or disabilities. And, some would say that P.T. Barnum was exploiting these individuals for these shows or these performers. The flip side of that coin is, in researching it, many of these people that were a part of this act really enjoyed doing what they did, and they liked being famous and liked having the interaction with other people that were similar to them. But of course, today, with the advent of science and now explaining what they thought was unexplainable at the time, it certainly is a whole different ballgame. We recognize that individuals with disabilities in our community were inclusive. They're like us. So it's a lot has changed since this film came out. In fact, this film was banned in many countries for many years because of the outright display or exploitation of individuals with physical differences. England had it banned for 30 years. Probably why this is in French. So this is a photograph that was taken around 1924, which was a few years before the film came out in 1931. And this is a photograph of P.T. Barnum's group of performers. And, when you look at these individuals. They all have some differences about them. And then it wasn't clear what those differences were. They were just different. And they were seen as people wanted to come and see them because it was rare. You didn't commonly encounter individuals that had these particular differences. But now we can recognize some of these differences specifically. I don't think I have a pointer, but I can walk and point. This young man, he is not a child, but a full-grown adult. His name was Charles Stratton, and he was known as Tom Thumb with P.T. Barnum, and he, we now know, he has a form of dwarfism, specifically something that I would call in my practice achondroplasia or something called hypochondroplasia. It's a type of skeletal dysplasia where the long bones, our femurs and our humerus, they're significantly shortened, and it's a genetic disease, and it's can be passed down in families. Similarly, this individual, let me say his name correctly, his name was Simon Metz, and he had microcephaly. Some of us may have heard of microcephaly before. It's been in the news related to the Zika virus, but it is a very small head. So really small head doesn't allow brain growth. So he would have had profound intellectual disability, which really is quite sad if you think about the exploitation of him in terms of P.T. Barnum's kind of group of performers. The individual that you certainly can't miss up top, he's very tall. He was named Jack Earl. They referred to him as the tall man, which is appropriate. He was about, they said, it varies from 7'7" to like 8'4", but incredibly tall. And similarly, Andre the Giant, which we probably are all familiar with Andre the Giant. He was a boxer. He and Jack Earl had the same condition, and they have something called acromegaly. Acromegaly is when you have excessive growth hormone. So your bones grow, they never stop growing. You know, all of us hit growth spurts as we age, and usually it kind of peters out by the time we're out of high school. But someone with acromegaly, it never stops. And while that might sound, oh, kind of cool, I can be tall. I can certainly appreciate that. I'm vertically challenged, so, but being that tall also means that your organs don't stop growing. So a lot of these individuals would die from end organ failure. He passed away himself, Jack did, when he was only 41 from end-stage renal disease. And we know that Andre the Giant, similarly, he had multi-system organ failure as a result. Something else, if you see the far left individual, I think, a few different names he went by. I think one was like Wolf Man, one was Lion-Faced Man, but he had a lot of hair growth on his face, and that was a result of something we call hypertrichosis, which is just an overabundance of hair growth, usually in the facial area, and it can be caused by a couple of different things, different inheritance patterns as well. What I think is something that I wanted to point out is that not only are there people here that have some physical differences about them, variations of normal, if you will, but there are also two sets of multiples. So we have triplets on the far right, and we have two twins. They're separated, but you can pick them out on the top there. That's really important for this time period because multiple gestations in the 1930s was probably not heard of. Pregnancies are high risk today when you are carrying twins or triplets. Much less back then. It would have been certainly would have been rare or considered an oddity to see a living twin or living group of triplets. So another interesting addition to his group of performers. So, you know, with the acknowledgement of individuals having these genetic differences. And by the way, the word genetic, it's coming, but it's not really used as frequently yet. It's more just you're identifying people who have physical differences. Some people or scientists are thinking that, okay, yeah, this must run in a family. This probably has something to do with the body, but they still weren't exactly sure how or why. So with the acknowledgement of individuals in society with these differences, the science of eugenics was born. Anyone ever heard the term eugenics before? Yeah. So eugenics tends to have a pretty negative connotation, as it should, from where it was born. But Francis Galton coined this term, and that was in 1869. And he believed that intelligence was hereditary. He said that a man's natural abilities are derived by inheritance, not by environment or their life-learned abilities. So that's something we know that's not necessarily true. We know that to be true today. But the term eugenics, it's a controversial term. And basically what it's saying is that it's the idea that we can select against bad traits in society. We can select against mental health issues. We could select against intellectual disability, poverty, any undesirable trait. Probably the most well-known example of negative eugenics is the Holocaust. That was a mass genocide of individuals that were seen as undesirable by their government, by Nazi Germany. So that is a very specific example of eugenics. The United States issued sterilization laws in the 1930s, where people who had physical disabilities were forced to be sterilized. They could not reproduce. And so all of this is gaining ground because they're recognizing there are people in the community that have these differences. So what's interesting about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, this film that was first written as a book, and the book was written only a few years after eugenics was coined. So the book was written in, let's see, I have it written down here. I thought I did. Eugenics was coined in 1869. This was written a few years later. So it was, interestingly though, produced in 1941, released in 1941, and that's when the eugenics movement was at its peak. So when we saw the Holocaust, that's when we saw sterilization laws being enforced. And so the idea of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is that this person who has these desirable traits, Dr. Jekyll, he can drink the serum and he turns into Mr. Hyde, who has these undesirable traits. He's kind of crazy, psychotic, he has a tendency to do unfavorable things, and then he can switch back. And so the eugenics stage at this point had really reached its peak when this was released, and I think it's a good example of how people were thinking in that, okay, we recognize that there's part of us, we're not sure what it is, but some people have these undesirable traits, some have these desirable traits, but they had not put a pointer to it. They didn't know why. And this serum that he would drink, I think, was this movie's way of saying there's something there that we don't know about. There's a science to it, but we haven't figured it out yet. Going along those same lines, the Island of Lost Souls. Many of you may have heard of the Island of Dr. Moreau. That was a novel that was written, and that's what this film is based on, that novel. What's really cool, I think, about this particular time period, and this is 1932, the Island of Lost Souls came out at the time when genetic manipulation, the term, was first used. So it was used at the 6th International Congress of Genetics in Ithaca, New York, and genetic engineering was coined, was defined. It wasn't defined in relation to humans, but it was defined in relation to the application of genetic principles to animal and plant breeding. Can you guys guess what the first modified crop was? Corn, that's right, yep. And so they talked about corn at this Congress meeting, and it was the first genetically modified crop. So the idea that you could genetically modify anything was just kind of mind-blowing at this point in time. But not to Dr. Moreau. He knew that you could potentially genetically engineer humans, right, from his idea. So he was this visionary doctor at the time, but he was not practicing in a way that we would have felt is ethical today. Dr. Moreau thought that he could combine humans and animals to create this perfect creature, this genetically engineered creature. And so there's no doubt that this movie and the book itself was directly related to the fact that this genetic engineering had become this new term that was used in science. Just to talk a little bit more about eugenics, because I think it is important. Negative eugenics measures, I mentioned the Holocaust and genocide, that was an extreme movement for eugenics. Other negative measures that were used would be you're basically restricting these undesirable traits through immigration, so not allowing immigration to occur, discouragement or prohibition of marriage among people that may have certain disabilities or physical differences, sterilization, and euthanasia. Positive eugenics did develop out of negative eugenics, thankfully. And positive eugenics is what it sounds like, is that it's kind of the other end of the spectrum. It's encouraging people with those desirable traits, people that are healthy, people that are high achieving, people that are intelligent, to procreate, have babies. Let's make, more people like you. So still a little, the flip side of that coin, a little ethically concerning, but that did produce the movement that to now, I very much feel like public health is an extenuation of this positive eugenics movement. We want people to be healthy, we want them to live longer, we want them to have quality of life. And so public health, I would argue, is kind of where we are now in terms of this positive eugenics movement. But again, you hear the word eugenics, and always it has that negative connotation because people think back to when people were the forced sterilizations and the forced euthanasia. So can you guys see Frankenstein okay? This little, the sun goes down, you might see him better. Frankenstein and Dr. Moreau were these visionary scientists, right? I mean, it was in the 30s, but they were way ahead of their time. They thought about what could happen if science went the way that they wanted it to. They took it into their own hands. And, Dr. Frankenstein said, I am creating this monster for the betterment of humankind. He really believed that. Dr. Moreau believed that too, but we all know what happened. He created a monster, and Dr. Moreau was creating, half human, half animals. So I think this is where, in my presentation, where I really want to talk about that societal fear and that societal anxiety of science going too far. People have this fear of what if science goes too far? What happens if we create a technology that we can't control? Or what if we don't fully understand it? I will go ahead and tell you that we do not fully understand genetics, and we can't control it. So it's here, right? That type of science, that type of technology is here. Have any of you heard of CRISPR in the news? So CRISPR, it's an acronym, CRISPR, and it's a technology where we can essentially go into the human genome, we can take out a piece of DNA that we want to fix or alter, we can replace it with something else, we can remove it altogether, or we can even change the genetic code behind it. And it's being used as treatment right now as essentially gene therapy for the treatment of certain diseases. Now, this is all on a research protocol. This is not available clinically. But Feng Zhang, who was one of the co-inventors of this technology, he advised, right when it came out, we need to be careful. We need to proceed with a lot of caution. Because the way this is working now, so short genetics lesson, we're all made up of billions and billions of cells, and we all have thousands and thousands of genes within our cells, and our genes are made up of DNA. Well, DNA is read, or our body reads our DNA by a series of letters, and it then creates a protein, and a protein is what actually is functioning inside of us for normal development. So anyone that has a genetic disease, the idea behind CRISPR is that you can go in, you can find that gene that's causing that disease, you can find those series of letters that may be jumbled up or switched around, and you can take those out and you can replace it with the normal series of letters, and you are then correcting that gene. Your body is then reading that gene correctly, it's making the right protein, and you no longer have disease. So that is what we want to use CRISPR for. What's important to know about CRISPR is that it's being done on what we call somatic cells. Somatic cells are not our germ cells. They are not egg, they are not sperm. So anything we do to individuals with this disease cannot be passed down to future generations. It's just affecting that one person. the caution, the concern is that this type of technology might be used to affect generations of people. If you go in and change that DNA sequence that's going to be passed down, we call those germ cells. If you affect those germ cells, that egg cell or that sperm cell, then you're talking about designer babies, right? We've all heard that terminology before, designer baby. Let's affect change on traits. And that's not why CRISPR was designed. CRISPR is to prevent disease. But we have to always consider when we make something, can we control it? And thankfully today we have government bodies in place that do have restrictions and boundaries surrounding certain technologies that are made. So changing traits such as IQ, hair color even, this little baby, it says a sprinter, and it's pointing to his calf. I don't know if we know the gene for that, but the idea of changing someone's traits to have this perfect child or this perfect baby to go on for generations, again, that speaks back to this whole positive eugenics movement. And that's not what we're talking about. That's what we want to be cautious about. So I think Frankenstein was, this film was very avant-garde. It's foreshadowing this kind of important genetic discoveries that came later. This next slide is a busy one, and it's just meant to show that World War II is ending, the Cold War is beginning, the arms race, all of that's happening. You think a lot about the arms race, race to space, but what you sometimes forget is that what's actually happening behind the scenes is that this is a war between scientists. Germany, the United States, Russia, they all have these scientists that are being, what fuels innovation more than competition? Nothing. If you are competing with somebody else to get there, you're going to work harder, you're going to work faster. What they also had in their back pocket is money. The government was funding all of this. So you see in the 40s and 50s this huge boom of scientific discovery. And I have a few photos up here. Some may be recognizable, others not. But this was the computer at the bottom left that was used to break the Nazi code, the Enigma code by the Germans. So computers were being made, one of the earliest computers. This magazine cover is the think tank. That was the RAND Corporation back during World War II, where they put together a group of scientists to come up with how are we going to make the A-bomb? How are we going to get to space first? The RAND Corporation still exists today, by the way, but that was full of people that you hear of. John Nash. John Nash was A Beautiful Mind. You might remember that movie. He had schizophrenia, but he came up with the Nash equilibrium, which was the basis for game theory, and that's what we used, the CIA still uses today. And our economy, our political science, all budgeoned out of this RAND Corporation or this think tank. Albert Einstein, E = mc squared, that was the equation that started the A-bomb. So he was also a part of the RAND Corporation. And then most importantly, and what pertains most to our talk, is that the 1950s was possibly one of the largest decades for genetics. It was in 1952 that we made the discovery that genes are actually made of DNA. So deoxyribonucleic acid. You guys all remembered that, right? Yeah. So that's what makes up DNA, a series of nucleotides, as I mentioned, and that was discovered in 52. 1 year later, James Watson, Francis Crick, they founded the double helix. They found out that this DNA was wound in a helical structure and that it was then packaged into chromosomes. And it was not until 1955 that we discovered that all humans have 46 chromosomes, all in 23 pairs. So the 50s were just huge in terms of science and genetics. And the movies that came out in the 50s were a sign of those times. You can see it was a big change. You went from Dracula and Frankenstein and these kind of almost, yes, they were monsters, but you felt for them. You had an empathy for the monsters that were in those movies. They were almost romanticized a bit. Then you go to these sci-fi kind of otherworldly, other creatures, us versus them. It was twofold. It was the U.S. and the communists, political undertones with these movies. You can see in The Day the Earth Stood Still, you've got tanks in the background and armies in the background. The U.S. Capitol is even in the bottom left-hand corner. So a very political film poster for The Day the Earth Stood Still. Similarly, over in Invaders from Mars, again, you've got soldiers with hard hats on. You can kind of see them on the bottom there. So twofold, political undertones from what was happening in our world with the war, but also the science, this identification of, yes, humans are made up of DNA. Well, what other life forms exist? I love The Shape of Water. Have you guys seen The Shape of Water? The Creature from the Black Lagoon was also a film in the 50s, and it fits nicely here because it's another otherworldly creature. Its DNA probably does not look like ours. And so The Shape of Water is kind of an extension of this film. And Guillermo del Toro, who wrote The Shape of Water, he got his idea when he was 6 years old from The Creature from the Black Lagoon. And he says that, the project really began at age 6 when he saw the 1954 movie with underwater shots of the gill man reaching out toward the legs of Julia Adams. He thought it was so romantic and exciting that he assumed the two would end up together. He was really disappointed when they didn't. So we know that directly influenced The Shape of Water movie because we know that they do end up together. Sorry if none of you have seen that. But I think what's interesting is if you look at the gill man that was here and the gill man there, they really aren't that different. They really do look similar. The makeup and now granted, it's a little bit more modern, but still the same thing. It's a person. It's not CGI. It's a person dressed up in a suit. So the difference, though, I think from the artwork with these posters is in the emotional take from the posters, you know. And the one from the Black Lagoon, Julia Adams looks petrified. She's trying to get away, whereas Sally Hawkins appears desperate. She longing for him. So I think Del Toro knew that he wanted this movie to be a love story, and that the blue background, that really subtle blue, kind of lends us to believe like this is more tranquil. This is lending itself more to a love story than a horror movie. So my genetics take on this: we are not that far from fish. Little did they know that the creature from the Black Lagoon would not be as far-fetched as they actually believed. We all have fishy features. Fish don't have fingers, but they do have the gene that we all have that makes it possible for them to have fins. So there's a gene called sonic hedgehog. And to use my husband's, I was talking to him last night about this talk, and he was like, Jessica, that sounds like a Sega movie. You have to explain what Sonic Hedgehog means. Not Sonic the Hedgehog, but the name of the gene is actually called sonic hedgehog. And it was discovered in the 1980s. And what this gene does in our body, it instructs us how to form digits. It's important in embryonic development, in our patterning, so our symmetry. It also is cell growth. So scientists, they can mutate sonic hedgehog in various animals. And when they do that, they may grow extra fingers, extra fins. They might have webbed fingers or not webbed fins. And so what's interesting here is that we know that if any of you are looking for a good book to read, this is a good one. It talks about how we really do, our oldest ancestor is the fish. Fish, they live in water, they swim, but a surge or an overexpression of the sonic hedgehog gene, whatever, thousands of years ago, allowed them to ultimately come onto land. Because they was able to crawl into land with the development of fingers from fins. So, kind of cool. What does that look like today if we were to have changes in certain sonic hedgehog pathway in our body? Sometimes people have extra fingers or extra toes. Sometimes people even have webbing between their fingers or toes. We call webbing syndactyly and we call extra digits polydactyly. It's a very common feature, see it a lot. It's not harmful, it's surgically correctable, but it is usually due to some sort of genetic change in that sonic hedgehog gene. So, kind of neat. Let's switch gears just a little bit and move into the 60s, which we think about what influences, what was happening in the 60s to come up with Psycho and whatever happened to Baby Jane. Again, the fears that exist within us rather than the fears that are external. These were internal fears, anxieties, a lot of PTSD. Remember, they're men coming back from war. So a lot of these soldiers were experiencing PTSD. We didn't call it that at the time, but we knew that there was something emotionally affecting their psyche. So in the 50s, institutions were common. Electric shock therapy was common. Lobotomy was still practiced. It wasn't until the 60s, the early 60s, JFK passed an act that kind of forced our society to take a look at how we were managing our members with mental health concerns. And it ultimately supported deinstitutionalization and wanted prescription drugs to be more of the management rather than putting people into institutions. Psycho was written in 60, and Whatever Happened to Baby Jane was in 62. So these were just 1 or 2 years before that act was passed. And these movies, have y'all all seen either of these movies? Both of these movies? People are kind of nodding, yeah. Both of them instill fear about someone with mental health concerns. You don't feel sympathy for these individuals. You certainly don't feel sympathetic for Norman Bates. And, you know, Betty Davis, who plays Baby Jane, you don't feel sympathetic for her either because she's torturing her sister throughout this movie. But in reality, the underlying problem is that they both have psychiatric illness. And so these films prior to, you know, in the early 60s were kind of speaking to this fear of people who have mental health concerns. And some of that has lasted, but I would say and hope that today mental health is talked about more. It's not so much stigmatized. And I get a lot of questions about it in my own practice. Are there genetics? What are the genetics that contribute to psychiatric illness? And a lot of that, the answer is on the right side of the screen, that we don't really have one specific gene we can identify that's going to say you're going to get anxiety or say you're going to get bipolar disorder. It's really a combination of genetics and environmental factors that lead to psychiatric illness. And so I spend a lot of time counseling patients about this because almost everyone has either a personal or family history of anxiety or depression. It's just that common. On the left side of the screen, there is one particular condition that comes to mind. It's a deletion on the 22nd chromosome. And this missing genetic information does increase someone's risk of developing schizophrenia. So this is one example of how a genetic change in somebody's body, an identifiable genetic change, does predispose to psychiatric illness. But it's few and far between. It's usually the one on the right side. Just to speak again to the films today related to comparing them to Psycho and Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, those movies, again, this fear, you compare that today. I was thinking about what movies have I seen recently where I really genuinely feel bad for the person. The Joker was the first thing that came to mind. I don't know if you've all seen the new Joker. It's a hard film to watch, but it's a great film. I mean, he's obviously is not a good guy. He's definitely an antagonist, but you really feel for him because he has a significantly underlying mental health concern. The other one that comes to mind is Fight Club, one of my favorite movies, but mental health issues there too, and you really have a lot of sympathy, I think, there for, what's his name? Durgan. Whatever. Yeah. All right. So moving on, I'm almost going to be wrapping up, and I think that I couldn't not put Alien up because this is my favorite poster, by the way. It's simple, it's dark, it's just, I don't know, it screams science to me. Interplanetary travel, artificial intelligence, extraterrestrial life, this fear of the unknown, again, playing on societal fear. What do we not know? This is 1979. So there have been some other really important genetic discoveries leading up to this. Genetic engineering, the creation of the first recombinant DNA molecule happened in 1972. So you're like, well, what is that? So basically a recombinant DNA is taking DNA from two different species. So let's say I take the insulin gene from Wilson, and so the gene in his body that creates insulin, and then I take that gene and I insert it into a bacteria, the genome of a bacteria. We can then use the bacterial genome to synthesize or replicate Wilson's insulin gene, and that's how we make insulin. So we have insulin on a large scale for people who have diabetes. Antibiotics, same thing. We're taking human DNA, putting it into a vector of some sort, whether it's a virus or a bacteria, and we're creating large amounts of antibiotics. So that's how we're synthesizing that. And so the first time that happened was in 72. Alien, it's this human, not human, together in space in one vector or vehicle, if you will. I just saw a lot of connections there. They probably didn't think about that when they were making the movie, but it's something that I thought about. And then following the discovery of recombinant DNA in 72, Fred Sanger created sequencing. Sequencing is what has just changed everything about what we know about genetics today. Sequencing is reading the genetic code. We can read our DNA, we know where there are changes. That's how CRISPR exists, because sequencing came first. If we are looking for genetic disease, I am sending a patient sample off to be sequenced. You hear about the Human Genome Project. That is, the goal is to sequence the entire human genome. We haven't done that yet. We have sequenced the human exome, but not the genome, so there is a difference. So that was in 77. So, I felt like that really drove Alien in a way, whether Ripley Scott knew it at the time. Ridley Scott knew it at the time or not. So then that lastly kind of got me thinking about, how do these movies know what's happening? How do they have all this information that they need to make sure that they're doing this technology correctly, making sure it's reasonable and believable? And so I found the Science and Entertainment Exchange. You guys might have all heard of this before, but it is a part of the National Academy of Sciences. And this is basically a conglomeration of individuals across the U.S. who all have specialties in different areas of science, and they are called upon to consult with filmmakers to make sure that what they're doing is accurate and that the science is there to make sure the story is believable. So I thought that was kind of neat. All right, my last thing. I couldn't leave here without talking about zombies. I don't really have a great genetic connection to zombies, so what I'm going to use this slide for is a summary of what I've been talking about this whole time, which is this societal fear that's instilled upon us based on the time period of when these films were created. So this is a diagram of, you can see that there were 3 zombie films made in 1930, and there are projected, probably now in 2020, probably well close to 300 or more films about zombies coming out. So this zombie trend has been increasing. And again, I think that the history of the zombie best portrays our history of social fears and anxieties surrounding all different types of worldly events. So very early on, there was this fear of the other from voodoo or primitive culture, and that can be summed up in White Zombie. That was the movie that was made in 1932. And then we think about the atomic zombie, fear of nuclear extinction, the apocalyptic zombie, a response to civil rights in the Vietnam War. That can be seen in Night of the Living Dead. The tagline for Night of the Living Dead was "Fear the dead, but fight the living." So really speaking to civil unrest, racial issues, segregation, all of that was kind of explored in Night of the Living Dead. Then you move forward a little bit and you think about the pandemic zombie, fear of mass contagion. I think we all have a little bit of that fear right now. But the CDC came out with, literally the CDC made this, get a kit, make a plan, be prepared for the zombie apocalypse. And this was several years ago that they made that. And then where we are now, which is the post-apocalyptic zombie, or the fear of each other. And I think that's probably best summed up by The Walking Dead, if you guys have already seen that. Again, fear the zombie, but fight each other is another, probably another tagline that we're seeing today. Unfortunately, today we also have civil unrest and concerns in our country regarding that. So I think that the zombie has kind of created a circle. So anyway, I was going to share, I guess there was a story. So going back to white zombie, for those of you who aren't familiar with the whole idea of a zombie, it is from Haitian culture. And when I was living in New York, I lived in Brooklyn, and my community was largely Haitian. So I had a elderly woman in my building who was a Haitian woman, and she told us the story one evening that we asked her about it. We said, what is this whole deal with the zombie and the voodoo? Like, we know that it's Haitian roots, but why? And she said that the idea is that if somebody wrongs you in that culture, if you're wronged in any way, you can then essentially kill that person, but you aren't killing them. You're actually using a neurotoxin. The pufferfish neurotoxin is the one that is used, and it kind of paralyzes you, for lack of a better word, for a significant amount of time, and then you're buried alive. You're then dug up. And I think she said they're hung upside down until the blood comes back into the limbs, body, whatever. And once you awaken, you are then a slave to that person that you wronged. And so that is where the zombie came from. It's kind of interesting. And I believe her. All right, so not a genetic take, but a scientific one at that. So that's all I have. I appreciate your time, and this was fun, so thank you for having me. I'll take any questions.